In this video, we're going to learn about how we can build a web app which uses GPT API calls. Nothing fancy, but which utilizes FastAPI as a backend and actually release the responses to JavaScript to be presented in a HTML format, which is styled by Tailwind CSS. The reason why I wanted to do this because I'm not an expert front-end developer or anything like that, and using FastAPI, I've run into quite a few troubles in the past and still do, especially with like routes, using middleware, and also serving static files and things like that. So I just wanted to just go over some of the stuff, starting with a much more simpler file, which actually has the script in the index.html, and then slowly moving into a secondary, more complex example. And just going to talk about each things which were problematic to me in the hopes of learning it together and hopefully allowing us to build much better web apps in the future using HTML styled by Tailwind CSS, using JavaScript as the front end and FastAPI, Python as the back end. Let's start with a very basic example. Here in this case, the web page. The JavaScript is just making a fetch call to this URL, and the FastAPI side, we are actually receiving it as a post request, and then actually making a call to GPT 3.5 Turbo, and just we're not even putting any custom user input. We're just getting a joke back, and this joke is sent back, and then the JavaScript just displays it in the output element right here, which is styled by Tailwind CSS, and every time we refresh this, we get a new joke. So that's it, right? But this is the base case. So let's start by talking about this. Now the requirements for this is OpenAI. You need to have FastAPI installed and Unicorn to run the backend server. You would also need Node.js to run JavaScript in your system, generally speaking. So those are really the only requirements. Now we're going in the spirit of keeping it simple. I have the script, JavaScript, written in the HTML file for this first example. And then we have our FastAPI code in a main.py file. As you can see, our folder is structured as in, so we are looking at the basic folder. We have a static folder, which we are having our index.html in it. And we have the main.py file. This example is something else, which I want to talk about later. So all we have really is the static file with the index.html and the main.py file. Before continuing, I just want to mention the echohive.live website, which has all my 140 plus free coding videos. You can use this website to search and browse all my videos and find the code download links. It's echohive.live. Link will be in the description. So let's start with the obvious. Why do we need a static folder? You don't exactly need it. But since, I guess I should put it this way, that FastAPI it's just if you want to organize all your files. For example, if you had a website which was serving a lot of like images and stuff like that, or multiple pages, then having the static folder or other folders, I believe, is just a way of organizing. I have actually asked this to Bing chat, and it says you might want to serve the index.html file from static folder if you want to serve a static HTML file as a home page. See, the thing is that you can actually serve the HTML as a dynamic HTML and even your JavaScript directly from FastAPI. What I mean is, this actually brings us to the example.py file. See, in our case, we have the index.html under static, and we are just simply mounting it using this mount the static files directory. Okay. And then we set HTML to true, and then we serve it like this. But essentially, we could have served this entire HTML along with this JavaScript using HTML response and send it with FastAPI to the front end. Okay. Now, what is the difference? The thing is that if you do it this way, then you can actually dynamically change. I guess this is called server-side rendering. You can actually modify, right, this HTML file dynamically in Python, maybe depending on what the user or what the browser is sending you, and then send back a modified version of the HTML file, including maybe the modified version of the JavaScript. So keep that in mind. So The reason why it's called static is obviously we're not going to change it, right? But the static folder can also be used, for example, to serve like static images and stuff like that. And as a way of, you can also think of it as a way of organization. Now, another thing to mention about the static folder is that you have to mount it, okay, using the static files, which we are importing here up here from FastAPI. When you mount this, if you do need to define, well, see, if you mount it and then define the slash path, which is your default path, right? Then whenever you launch your server, directly the server will actually launch into the HTML file. Here, if you were to define something else like static or something like that, then you would have to enter that URL / the static, okay? If you were to look at it in our browser, you see this local host, and as soon as every time we refresh, we get a new joke. So this is serving the HTML right here. If you were to define that static over there, for example, then we would have to go to this static extension. So that's why we leave it as such. But because this slash is the catch-all path, it's like the default path, you have to define it after all your other routes. So this was one of the problems I ran into quite a lot, because I actually had this up here, okay, and that was a problem. We'll move this up here and save, then you're gonna start getting some issues, because then your fetch request is gonna stop finding the API route, because it's actually getting stuck right here. So keep that in mind. For example, this is something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind, the Cors Middleware, because of some security reasons, for example, I believe browser security reasons, you have to define what allowed origins, like which URLs can actually access the server. Here in this case, we are allowing all origins, all methods such as get, post, and update and delete and such. And so this is not recommended for production. Keep that in mind. Okay, so two things to note is that when you're mounting your static files, okay, have them after all the other paths and routes that are defined, such as in this case, API. Another thing is that you have to allow whatever URLs you're using in the Cors middleware. We are currently allowing all, but like I said, this is not recommended for production. Keep that in mind. By the way, these files will be available at my Patreon. I try to go over the code and I try to explain it in full in all of my videos, in most of my videos. But if you really find my content engaging and helpful, then, and if you're feeling generous, you might as well become a member. But becoming a member allows you to access 100 plus project and its code downloads as well. The link will be in the description. Another interesting dilemma is whether to use get or post. So I did some research on this. So essentially, if you both the fetch request and the fetch request that you're going to make with JavaScript, okay, defaults to get, unless you specify a post method. So if you use get, then your fetch request is actually becomes so much more simpler. Maybe if I go back, yeah, never mind. So your post get requests are simpler, but I want to know what are the differences. Essentially, this when you're defining your routes with get or post, whatever you're using here in your FastAPI has to match whatever you're using in JavaScript side. Get fetch request automatically defaults to get. If you don't want to define it with the method here, then you have to set this to get. Now, Bing's response to this was that get request is typically used to retrieve data from server. Post request, on the other hand, typically used to send data to the server. I realized that post request is done usually when you want to send some data to the server and to change the server's state somehow, then use post. Get request when you want to retrieve data from the server without changing its state. This is like the easiest explanation I could find. But on this website, which was trying to explain the difference between get and post, it gives some explanations, but here, hacked, easy, it says the get requests are easier to hack, post requests are not. Usually speaking, for our use case, okay, it's recommended that we use get, because apparently post can actually execute some stuff on the server side, or at least has the capability, because it can change the state of the server. So I wasn't really sure. I used post here, but I believe in our use case, since we're making a call to GPT and actually just returning, we probably would be better off by using get. But anyway, I use post. When you use post, you have to specify in your JavaScript code to use post as well. Okay. So next, let's talk about how do we run the server. So now we have a backend server. FastAPI is initiating a backend server. And the front end, HTML, combined with JavaScript, is actually communicating with this backend server. Here in this case, this is our front end, and main.py is our backend. So we need to start the server. To be able to start it, we use the unicorn here in our case. So you have to be in the correct folder, right? I am in the FastAPI new folder and basic folder because we're looking at the basic case. And I'm typing in the terminal simply unicorn. And then I say main is the name of our file, .py file. Whatever your .py file is, your server file, you have to use it here. And then we do colon app. App is what we have defined on line 6, which is the FastAPI app. And then after that, we say dash reload. This, if we load it like this, then if we make a change into any of our files, then the server will restart to reflect it on the browser. So when we run this, we're going to see some things happening. So unicorn is starting and application startup complete. Now we see this URL. We can actually, let me bring this here, control click on it, and then it should start our server. And then our website, web app, starts at the specified port. Every time we refresh, make an automatic call for a joke, and hopefully each time we're getting a different joke displayed. Every time we refresh, JavaScript is actually calling this main function. It's actually printing hello world to the console, in the terminal, as you can see. Then makes a call to GPT 3.5 to get a joke. We actually print the response here as well. Then we return it as a JSON object. See, we say message is our response. Then this is received by JavaScript right here. API URL is defined as the default path, our local host / the API root. As you can see, this is what is defined, right? /API. That's why we're adding it here. And then this function, async function, fetch data, makes a fetch request to that API URL. Okay, you have to make sure that your roots are defined carefully. This has to match whatever is defined in your post request here or get request. And then since we're doing a post, then we have to define this as well. I believe header is not exactly necessary, but I have it here. Then we await that JSON and we assign it to data. Then we get from the DOM element by ID output, which is this element right here, okay, define. And then we change its inner text to data.message. Why do we do this? Because we are sending this object with the message key. So this is the data, and its .message key is the response which was returned from the GPT API. And that's why when we do that, then automatically HTML displays it in our browser like this. Every time we refresh it, this is the process that is taking place. Now, to be able to see your console, if you were to take a look at here, if this process, this fetch process, were to fail, say we say catch this error and console.error, we want to log this or print it to the console. Well, where can we see this? In JavaScript, you don't actually get to see it here necessarily, but you can see it in your console here. You can initiate it. Here I'm using Chrome by going to More Tools, Developer Tools, or in Windows, Control-Shift-I will open up your console. And if you have any error message or any log statements, you can see it here. We can actually demonstrate it by adding a console.log to the beginning of this function. If we save this and refresh this, I believe, see we are now printing fetching data from API because we just added there. So you can see your console logs here, okay? And see if you're running into any errors. Okay, now let's move on to a more complex example. Like I said, I will have all these files available at Patreon. So we were looking at the basic folder. Now I'm going to look at the medium folder. We still have the static and the main.py file. So nothing really changed in our server. Our server remains exactly the same. as you can see. We've already talked about it. But now we have separated our index.html and script.js file. If you look at our index.html, we have some styling that is applied. This is for some scroll bar, which we're going to take a look at. We are using a tailwind. Actually, we have both the tailwind CDN here and the link. I'm not sure if I'm doing it redundant, whichever one is actually taking precedent. Anyway, but these are all tailwind styling right here. It's much more concise and it takes much less space than CSS files. That's why, as you can see, we don't have a separate CSS file because we are using Tailwind CSS. We'll talk more in detail about Tailwind, but we have obviously an output and a text area and a button. And our JavaScript file, let's talk about this here in a second. Let's start the server. So I'm starting a terminal, then I'm going to start a command prompt. Make sure you're in your right environment where you have all your packages installed. Make sure you are in the right directory. We have to cd into the medium directory. And we write record main, that is the name of our file. We are in the medium folder. We have a main.py file. That's why main and app, app is what we have defined is the FastAPI app right here. And dash reload so we can have live reload. And our server has started. You can copy and paste this into your browser or control click on it. And when we load it, we see this text input area. There's no errors. I'm going to close the console and I'm going to say hello and click this button here. And then hello, how can I assist you today? So it doesn't have, if you ever ask it something else like, how are you? It's actually just going to replace this right here. I'm going to work to make this more elaborate, obviously, as time goes on. This was really to get some of the basic hurdles, which I believe a lot of people run into with using FastAPI and JavaScript together. So all the styling is handled here with Tailwind CSS, and our main.py is exactly the same. So what's happening in the JavaScript is that we actually receive the post request and we get the output element, which is in the index.html, right? Which is going to display our message. And then we set its display to block and we change its inner text. We also have an event listener for the button, which means when it is clicked, it takes the value of the input element, the ID in index. We have this text area with the ID input. So the JavaScript file actually takes the values of that element input and then uses the post data, gives it to the post data function right here, which is the function that is making our fetch call. So this message is sent to the server, and then we await the response. And when we have the response, we write it to the output element of the index.html. We have some other code to actually do some cool things. For example, as you see here, if we were to paste a multiple of the same item at some point, let's do this again. As you see, the text area is expanding up to a certain point, and after that, a scroll bar occurs. And also, if you pay attention, when we type something, this button changes color to green. This is all handled in JavaScript. If we look here, we have the input element by get element by ID. When there is input inside this input box, then we set its input.scroll height, which is determined right here in Tailwind, right here, makes h44. Tailwind doesn't exactly use pixels, but 44 was equal to about 7 lines of input, as you can see. One, two, three, four, five, six, 7 or 8 lines. Yeah, this is about what ChatGPT does. And finally, if there's an input in the text area, then we change the button color to green, else it's back to blue. This is to indicate we are doing this input area is not empty. Then we remove the blue and add the green styling to the Tailwind. And otherwise, we do the exact opposite. This is, if we were to clear it, it's blue. And if we have any input in it, it turns to green. So this is pretty much how we can build some simple web apps, hopefully, maybe you can find, maybe I hope you find this useful. Maybe this is useful scaffolding which you can use to build further improvements. Like I said, these files will be available at Patreon. Also, don't forget, check out ecolive.live if you would like to take a look at some of my other videos. You can also do a search. You can find the link to the original traditional autocoder, which I built a few months back. You can also check out the GPT-4 UI if you ever run out of your 25 times every 3 hours request limit at ChatGPT. There's also a shuffle option. You can read the descriptions, find the code download links to Patreon. I'm looking forward to making more videos about FastAPI, building web apps using GPT API. I hope you found this useful, and I'll see you in the next one.